Hello and welcome to the podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the organisation that's been the face of communal living in Britain since the 1980s. Whatever kind of intentional community you're interested in, whether it's communes, co-ops, co-housing or anything else, Diggers and Dreamers is where you begin. And now, here's our podcast host, Kirsten Stevens-Wood.
Today's Diggers and Dreamers podcast guest is Mary Inglis. Mary joined the Findhorn Community over 50 years ago in 1973. Bringing with her an interest in group development and having previously worked in the human potential movement, Mary arrived at Findhorn in its early years. At this point, people were living in caravans, and the founders, Peter and Eileen Caddy, receiving spiritual guidance as to the development and growth of the Findhorn community, which, at its peak, was to become home to over 400 people. Mary takes us through her own personal journey of being a resident of the Findhorn community and how things have changed over the years. This was a really interesting interview, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Okay, so our guest on today's Diggers and Dreamers podcast is Mary Inglis from Findhorn. Good morning, Mary. How are things with you?
Hello, Kirsten. Very good. It's a wonderful sunny autumn day up here.
Wonderful. And you are actually situated in Findhorn right now, aren't you? So you're right up in the north part of Scotland.
That's right, yes. And I just probably also need to make clear that there's a Findhorn village down the road. And so we are asked to call ourselves the Findhorn Community. So at the beginning of this, let's call it the Findhorn Community. And then as we go through, maybe call it Findhorn after that.
Oh, I'll try to remember that one. So, I would say that Findhorn is probably amongst those of us who are interested in any type of intentional community, the most well-known community in the UK. It's the one that people always ask about. It's quite famous. It's also been around for a long time. And I understand that you've been living at Findhorn for quite some time.
Yeah, 51 years.
Wow, that's amazing. So I guess a good starting point is what brought you to Findhorn? What was your journey and maybe some first impressions?
Yeah, okay. I think one of the I was really interested in what groups of people working together can achieve, both internally for the development of people in them. I was quite involved with the human potential movement in London, and actually prior to that in South Africa, where I was living at the time. I moved there when I was I'd been to school and university in South Africa, living in Lesotho, and was very involved in groups there, and particularly with something called Christian Education and Leadership Training, which was a group that worked with experiential programs that were interracial and interdenominational. And they were just kind of like amazing what happened in them as people worked with the positions and perspectives that they had and became really close, and profound personal transformations that kind of moved out also into societal shifts as well. In some ways, in small ways, but they created a network of communications and connections that were able to kind of seed pockets of change, I think, in South Africa. And there was something about having like a spiritual component there that was important. I came to the UK and got involved, as I said, very much in the human potential movement. Also involved in quite a lot of groups that were involved with societal change. I spent a summer in Northern Ireland working with Catholic and Protestant teenagers, both in leisure activities and working activities. and 6 months in the St Mungo community in London, working with destitute men. So I was kind of really interested in both, what happens for people in groups that work together intentionally, and either on their own awareness and growth or on some activity out in the world. And I heard about Findhorn. I heard it actually through my mother, who was living in South Africa. She was involved with the Quakers and with what was called the Christian Institute there. Both of them seeking to bring change in themselves and in South Africa. And she had heard about Findhorn from somebody in one of those groups who happened to have a sister living at Findhorn and was really intrigued by it, told me about it. I was in London by then. And then when she came over at one point, we have relatives living quite close to Findhorn, and we were visiting them, and we came through for a day to visit. Do you have a question?
No.
No, okay. And
well, I was actually thinking, I was wondering, because it's quite that what you were talking about in terms of the work that you were doing initially in South Africa and then obviously going to Northern Ireland, all of those sound like they're conflict management, supporting people through quite conflicting or quite difficult periods. So
yeah.
that must have been that was your background.
Yes, yes. That I think a lot of it was about fostering connections, and I realize that's something that's really important to me now, just given the the recent elections in the United States. I think it's really important that those of us who can, as much as possible, foster the connections that we have with one another, with nature, with our institutions,
Yeah.
that build a network of connectedness and coherence that can hold us through potentially troubled times and potentially divisive times. And I suppose that was there as a seed kind of thing back then. It was, can we create little embodied in ourselves and with one another, little embodies pockets of coherence and connectedness and hope and creativity, what can come out of those spaces. And for me, that's also kind of like what I would call a spiritual impulse as well. And one of the things I noticed in all of the things I was involved with was when that there was some kind of um, explicit spiritual recognition, not religious in terms of being connected with any particular religion or tradition, but like an awareness of something larger holding us and moving through us, and that we could engage with and give expression to somehow. That those groups moved faster.
So this took you all the way up to Scotland to visit relatives, and then in the meantime, you thought, "I'm going to go visit Findhorn." Was that part of the plan?
Well, when I came out, when we came out, yes, because we were visiting relatives close to Findhorn, an hour's drive. We need to go and see this place. So we came through, my mom and I, and we for a day, and we sat outside the community centre, and one of the members here was telling us about the work of the place, of like the inner listening that Eileen was doing, and the following the impulses of this inner voice, and the work with, there was a lot of work being done with nature, both physical and like non-physical, so that the working with the nature spirits and elementals and angels and devas that were in the place. There was a woman here who had a very strong connection with that. And he was telling us all about that. And I was sitting there outside the community center, and somebody came behind me and put their hands on my shoulder. And I thought, this is very nice. It's very welcoming, friendly. And when he finished talking, I turned around and there was nobody there.
Oh,
And it was kind of like, oh my goodness, there's something, there's something real here. And I also felt very welcoming. So I was just excited about this the potential of working with like a larger field, not just the human field, and not just the nature field, but a sort of like a subtle spiritual, energetic field. I don't know what to call it.
What was what was your first impressions? I always imagine kind of driving up a track or a road or something. What did you think when you were going there?
I don't know that I can even remember. um, I,
Was
when or when I arrived, it was like so. There was that visit, and then I went away, and then the following year I came
mm.
back for a month. It turned into two, um, and then went away because I felt I needed to be involved in more active things in the world as well. And it didn't feel like Findhorn at that point was engaged with that. But a couple of months later, I was offered a job that was absolutely, being able to be more active in the world. And at that point, I knew that I was coming back to Findhorn rather than taking that job, which was kind of a dream job at the time.
So it must have made a real impression on you when you were
Yeah.
sat there and you felt those hands.
Yes, yes, yeah. And so I came back and I just, jumped in. There was about 140 people at that point living, all of us in caravans. There, there had recently been built a community center. There was a sort of like communal kitchen, and there was a sanctuary, a meditation place where we were all expected to meet for meditations every day. And in fact, if you didn't turn up for the morning meditation for more than 2 days in a row, Peter Caddy, one of the founders, you'd find him coming knocking on your caravan door and, where are you?
So when you first moved to the community of Findhorn, the founder members, so Peter, Dorothy, and Eileen Caddy, they
Yes,
were very much as a presence. They were still there, still running the place. How
very.
how how did you find that? Because they've sort of become the myth, the sort of the mythical creatures of Findhorn now that they're no longer with us. How were they? How did you find that?
Oh, I really enjoyed them. Peter was very much the what Eileen would receive, what she called
Mm.
this inner direction. Things like, you know, start building a community center to feed 200 people at the time when the community was just, you know, 20 or so, something like that. It's ridiculous. And they would just like ask for it. The way they worked with it, they asked for it. They and then they just had faith it would come, and then people would start arriving, that were builders or architects or, just the resources that were needed for that to come into being started happening. And so Eileen would receive this guidance, and Peter would just follow it implicitly. And then Dorothy, in the meantime, she was instructed to. She also received like an inner guidance or inspiration, and she was directed to make contact with the nature world. And initially, she thought, "Oh, this is just going to be, I'll go for long walks in nature." And then she one day kind of was like just appreciating the garden pea and became aware of this huge presence that was like behind the pea. And it was like what she called it a deva, or an angel that held archetypal patterning for plant species, the pea species, wherever it appeared. And so that started her connection with the nature spirits and the elementals. And and all three of them are around, and you just hung out with them over meals in the community center, and would talk, ask questions. And I think there was a huge emphasis on how do we give expression to community, not intentional community, but the spirit of community with ourselves, each other, with our relationship with nature, with our relationship with the non-physical worlds, and huge exploration of, what did that mean? What did that mean? and they were just also part of the conversation. And then
It's quite, sorry, I was just thinking it's really quite a surprising, given that my understanding is that Peter Caddy came from a military background, and
yes.
you just don't expect, you always think of military kind of over here as I don't know what you'd call it, enforced, sort of, or following a certain line of thoughts and everything else, and then that sort of that creative, more mystical pathway. And I would never have seen those two kind of coming together, and yet it seems that it did.
Yes, I know. Just there was something about. I mean, he had an authority, but also an ability to structure things in a way, to organize them. Mm. But he wasn't authoritarian. If you had different ideas, he was very open to hearing them. And if he had a sense that that was the right way to go, even if it was something that was contrary to what he previously thought, he'd go with it. He had an extremely strong intuitive sense, and then also once he said, we're going in this direction, everybody sort of did. But it wasn't him, deciding it on his own in a way, although he kind of brought it into focus and moved things through.
Fascinating.
And
So when you joined, there's around about, did you say 150 people? So relatively small in terms of where Findhorn was going.
yes.
And you started as a member, or you had a particular role? How did you kind of join?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can I just say one other thing
Yeah,
about Eileen?
of course.
Is that she was receiving guidance for the community, and then there was a point at which she received guidance to stop receiving it for the community, because it was important that everybody learned to find their own connection with the inner spirit and with their own sense of direction. And that was a huge thing. And I think, really spoke to something self-organizing. And Peter absolutely followed that as well. So it became things, I don't know how to describe it. Sorry.
Fascinating. No, it's absolutely fine. We'll take whichever track we take. But yeah, so they were the organizers. So a lot of people possibly won't have read any of the history of Findhorn.
Yeah.
So Peter and Eileen were a couple, and then Dorothy came along shortly after, I believe, and they were the founder members.
No, they had worked, all three of them had worked together in Cluny Hill Hotel, which they then left. And I don't think we'd want, it's a long story about how, but they landed up here, the three of them, on the caravan park, having lost their jobs, and began growing vegetables to supplement their
their income, as you would. It's sensible. And that was when the messages began to come. So it's really interesting that you say that that after a certain period of time the messages actually said that that's it now.
Yes, that it needed to move out into a wider field. This wasn't about some central organizing thing, arranging everything. It was about everything in the field helping to organize it. That's how we would say it now. It's not how we said it then.
Yeah, of course. So relatively small, about 150 people, and we know now in retrospect that it grew significantly beyond that. Yeah. And I was just saying, what was your role? How did you join?
Well, I think there was somebody would like interview you and get a sense of what you were here for, what you could do. If Peter was involved, he would always thought, what do you do? And what can you do? And then find a space to put you to work. And basically, at the beginning, I was able to type, so I ended up typesetting all of the early publications. So I absorbed a lot of the stuff through my fingertips, in a way I like to say, and but also was part of the cleaning department. I cooked 5 afternoons a week. It was a 7-day working week.
Oh.
And all of us living, a lot of young people living in caravans, usually 4 people to a caravan. Sometimes there was one famous caravan called Seven Berth because there were 7 people in there, bunk beds. And we all ate together in the community center, and intense discussions around what this was all about. And it was very, very creative, very generative in a way.
Must have felt quite liberating to have come to a place where
Yes.
ideas were freely flowing between people.
Yes, yes. And I think one of the things that attracted me too was that I'd had some involvement with the Quakers, who talked about that of God in every person. And when I came here, it was like it's not just in every person, it's in everything. There's that of God, there's that of the sacred in every single thing that exists. And how do we, if that's true, how do we engage with that?
And so would you, so if you were there 50 years ago, then you probably would have been there during the influx, the sort of the societal shifts in terms of what we now call, I guess, the hippie movement. Did you see an influx of people coming, sort of chasing their ideas, trying to find enlightenment, trying to find a different way of living?
Yes, I think so. I think so. And it was, yes, we were seen locally as a hippie commune.
Yeah, of course. How did the local community respond to Findhorn Community developing?
I think in mixed ways. I think there was some interest, but also quite a lot of reservation about this like weird space. People, oh, that's it. I just remember people coming into the community. We had a category in the Home Office known as harmless eccentrics. So people who came here were let into the country in the category of harmless eccentrics.
Oh, I do like that.
Yeah, yeah.
How did you find out about that?
I don't remember.
Yes, that maybe that's on all our passports, our categories. So Findhorn's quite a complex place, really, because we always think of Findhorn as one space. From the outside, at least, it's like, oh, that's Findhorn, but actually, it's much more subtle than that. I believe there's like some parts of it are foundation, some parts of it are what might be termed the community. Could you just explain that for people?
Yeah, yes. Well, when I came here, the foundation had recently established itself as a charity, as an educational charity. Saw itself as, it started off growing plants, and then saw itself as growing people. And so basically everybody who came was part of the foundation. Foundation and community were the same thing. But then as it got bigger, more people were drawn to be here. Some people, and basically if you were part of the foundation, you worked full-time for the foundation. And you got, I think you paid initially to be here. And that's changed over the years, the length of time or the amount of money. I think it was £50 a month when I first came. And then once you became like a member, you would get room and board and £3 a week pocket money, basically. But you worked 100% for the foundation. But then as time went by, more people came, and they wanted to they didn't want to work part-time, full-time for the foundation, but they wanted to be involved. And then as more activities began developing, some of the activities could no longer fit underneath a charity. So people would develop, like there was a publishing company, which any charity can do, small, like any church, for instance, can do a small book publishing thing. But once it gets above a certain size, it becomes more of a business venture. So there were things like that happening. Somebody developed a solar panel, so that became a solar panel business that obviously couldn't fit within the foundation, the charity. So people began, initiatives that started in the foundation began moving out, and other people started coming in that wanted an engagement but not to be full-time foundation. So this community started evolving around the foundation, which caused some hiccups at times, because issues of inclusion and exclusion and who could meet in the community center. Things evolved over time, and different structures came in. And then there was a point where really the community was bigger. The membership of the community outside the foundation was bigger than the membership of the community within it. And so there was an organization formed called the New Findhorn Association, which began to create structures for the community as a whole. Because obviously the foundation couldn't govern the community, but also the wider community, but also the wider community couldn't tell the foundation what to do, couldn't be involved in their decision-making structures. So that things evolved over time around that. And the foundation also was basically the landowner, because there was a point at which, I've forgotten the dates, I think in the 80s somewhere, we bought the caravan park, because up until then it had been, basically, were caravans and bungalows starting to be built. But the land was owned, the caravan park was owned by someone else. And then we bought it. Wow. But it was the foundation, I say it was the foundation that bought it, because that was the largest being at the moment, which has meant that as the community got larger, the most of the facilities that were created that served both the foundation and the community, but were foundation owned. And in some ways that began becoming a bit too top heavy, I think.
So I was going to ask you, actually, that transition between there's quite a famous thing called the Dunbar number, which I'm sure you're aware of as a groups person. All right, okay. So Robin Dunbar did some research that looked at sort of community, not just community groups. He looked at tribes and regiments and all sorts of things. And there was this kind of key numbers at which there's a certain number, and off the top of my head, it's something like 120, where you recognize everyone in the group. You kind of vaguely know that they're part of your clan or your village, or they're yours, they belong to you. And then beyond that number, it starts to that starts to not work anymore, because you're not entirely sure whether they're part of your cluster of people or not. And at that point, things change in terms of community. And I was just thinking, as you were describing this transition from what I'm guessing, even 150 people over a period of time can feel quite an intimate, but you would recognize people and know their names, and have in jokes and have eaten with people fairly regularly, to the point where when you tip beyond that point, it becomes association as opposed to relationships, and how that might have changed your experience, your personal experience of living in Findhorn.
I think it certainly did. I think the first big one was when the foundation bought Cluny Hill Hotel, which is about 5 miles from the Findhorn Bay Caravan Park, which is where Peter and Eileen and Dorothy began the Findhorn community without knowing what they were doing. So suddenly we had 2 locations and a lot more people. So in a way, what happened, there was the Cluny people knew each other, that they were within that number, and that the park still was that, and somebody at that point, one of the trustees called it, this is cellular evolution. You know, each cell needs to be doing its own thing and to have a sense of it being part of a larger body. So I think that was a useful framework for us in thinking about it. But it's true. There was a point where I found it quite difficult that I didn't know everybody anymore. You know, somebody would walk in and it would turn out that they'd actually been living here for like 4 or 5 months and I hadn't even noticed them. Whereas when I first came here, you know, you met the people who were coming in to, you know, and who stayed and, you know, got to know them over meals and things like that.
Yeah. I wonder if you've got any interesting stories from, you know, those early days, anything that sort of you remember, or that I don't know, someone who perhaps has stuck in the history books of Findhorn.
Oh my. Nobody immediately coming to mind. They'll probably come up to, you know, in the middle of the night.
That's fine. Yeah, that's when my brain tends to work properly as well. So Findhorn has grown. I mean, at one point it looked like it was going to just continue to grow. All the beautiful images of are they the barrel houses and the, you know, fabulous landscapes. And in fact, I believe that you are the only fully blown eco village in the UK, as well as the largest intentional community, which is
Yeah.
quite phenomenal. But it's also more recent times there have been some changes that have taken place. In fact, some decline. I wondered if you might be able to talk us through that.
Yes, sure. Yeah, yeah. So just for a moment to speak to the thing about becoming an eco village, I think it was in the 80s, the work of like co-creation with nature, which was part of what informed the beginning, moved into not just work with gardens, but work with buildings and infrastructure and things like that, which is when the whole eco aspect came in, and build caravans and began to be replaced with ecological houses and a lot of experimental building and that sort of thing, which also strengthened in a way the community as a whole. But then the recent changes are that during the pandemic, the foundation, its main activity was educational programs. And meanwhile, all these other ventures in the community were happening, businesses forming, small businesses forming. Yeah, just a lot of different cells in a way, like the cellular evolution idea, you know, and with the ideal of each of them holding on to the principles of creating community with themselves and one another, with spirit, with what's around them, and then like the cells having connections together. And obviously, you know, structures evolved to facilitate that as well, the interaction between different groups. So during the pandemic, obviously, educational programs weren't happening, although some moved online with the foundation, and they needed to make a lot of people redundant. Quite early on in that process, one of the members here, set fire to the community center, which was the kitchen and meeting area, and also to the sanctuary, which is the meditation room. And they still have not been replaced.
That must have been devastating for the community.
Yes, it was huge, huge. And that particularly, well, for the community, it took away a lot of the meeting spaces, the gathering spaces that were important. Like, in a way, they were both, you know, kind of like, they were like the heart and soul of the place. And that went. So, you know, and it has particularly affected the foundation because they were no longer able to do programs. They had begun to do some programs over here at the park as well as at Cluny Hill.
So
but
just to put this in time scale wise,
yes,
there was the pandemic had created a sort of hole in the financial mechanisms of Findhorn, and
yes,
that had precipitated some redundancies.
Of the foundation, not of the community as a whole.
Right. So just of the foundation, and
Yes.
then the redundancies, that was the trigger for someone to have burned. So it was already, things were financially quite difficult at that stage.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So it affected the foundation and the wider community, or the community as a whole, in different ways. The foundation, sorry, I've got several different directions opening up in my head at once. Which one to take? So the community, particularly the community living at the park, began finding different ways of grouping. I mean, a lot of the businesses and things obviously continued, although quite a few of them also were interdependent with the foundation. So, that affected them, but they were able to continue. But for the foundation, it was more difficult. And particularly as they no longer had facilities here at the park to feed people. They moved programs over to Cluny, but after a while it became clear that, there was not enough income coming in to be able to maintain Cluny and the activities that were going on, and so round about this time last year they closed. They basically wound down. They are in the process of winding down the foundation, the trust, and Cluny Hill is on the market. There is a group of community people here who are exploring the possibility of buying it and making it a multi-purpose building, including some of the kinds of activities before. We don't know how that will work out. So that's in process. And what's also happened is that there's a new Scottish charitable body or status that can be applied for, which is called a SCIO, which I can't remember the Scottish charity. I don't know. Sorry.
That's okay. So it sounds like people are sort of looking around for different ways to perhaps preserve parts of the community, or to sort of, yeah.
Not so much preserve, I think, is like looking at what are the next steps. And the foundation owned almost all of or owned all the land at the park. And there is a community body that has come into being, a benefits society, Eco Village Benefit Community, I think it's called, which is also charitable. I think it's charitable, which basically has negotiated with the foundation to buy portions of the land at the park, so that the community maintains its presence. So there's much more work now at looking at being an intentional community. I think, I was saying earlier that it didn't start as an intentional community. It started as 3 people just following their inner sense of direction, and community evolved from that. But now it's very much, how do we create intentional community? How do we create a collective governance? How do we collaborate in educational offerings that are being made? Because there's lots of smaller groups that offer different educational things. Sometimes some of them ones who used to offer them through the foundation, some of them who didn't, some of them new initiatives. So it's an incredibly volatile place at the moment. There's a lot of creativity coming out, a lot of differences of opinion, a lot of
I'm sure. I mean,
things. And
it's
the foundation.
I'm just sorry. I think there's a very slight delay here, so I'm apologies, Mary. It's really interesting what you were saying about the fact that there's a lot of creativity and differences of opinion. Because I've just read quite a lot of research around things like creativity and innovation, particularly in the context of communities. And it does seem that disruption, maybe not this level of disruption, so it seems quite unfortunate, but disruption can actually be a really healthy trigger for reevaluation and new pathways to open up and invigoration sometimes. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure it doesn't feel like that right now. It sounds like some of it might be quite painful, but you know, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're past the most painful process. There was a point like I don't know, 18 months or so ago that was 18 months, 2 years ago was really difficult, where there was, quite a lot of blame going on. Whereas now I think there's a much more, there's a working together. And I think that was partly people trying to go back to how things had been in the past. And actually, I think it needs to be, we need to move forward into a different form. I think the foundation being the main landowner and, providing the facilities that the community used and appreciated, but didn't actually really have responsibility for, in a way was stifling a certain amount of growth. And it feels much healthier to me now. It feels like there's more air between the different bits. And the foundation is, although it's winding up as a trust and as a landowner, it has also created a new organization, the SKIO I was talking about, that will be continuing educational programs. At the moment, it's in a very small way, but they are retaining and keeping some of the land at the park in order that they can, as things develop, use that for staff and visitors and the running of programs. What those programs will be is unclear at the moment. I think it's a very much a incubation time, I think, for them and also for the wider community.
Yeah, time of change. I'm wondering because there's also have I heard of something called East Winds co-housing? Are they part of the new development or something completely different?
Yes, no, they're part of the community.
Hmm.
They're these new spaces that have been developed. People wanting to come and live here and be part of this experiment, which I think is still, I would call it an experiment in creating, it's experiment in creating community, but not just community with one another. I realize I keep emphasizing this, but creating community with the life around us, the natural life and the energetic life. Can we include as many dimensions as possible and weave the strands between them? So this East Winds was the first development, a whole bunch of ecological housing, which initially that used to be dunes that we used to go and walk on, and some of us longer term people go, oh no, you're going to take away our wonderful walking area. And now it's beautiful. And now there's not only east winds, there's also west winds and north winds.
Oh, right. Yeah, I see where that's going.
There's a lot of extra people. There's a certain amount. At one point there was a group called Dunelands, which was a group of people connected with the community and foundation who bought a large tract, a large section of the dunes. A small portion of that is earmarked for development. A lot of it is just dune lands to be maintained as dunes. And there's also something called hinterland, which is managing the forests. They're running courses there as well around ecological awareness. Nothing to do with the foundation, but it's an organization within the community that's emerged, partly from people who used to be part of the foundation, partly from other people who've come in. And there's also a green burial ground there. And my mother was the first person to be buried there,
Oh,
2007.
was that her wish?
It absolutely was. It absolutely was. And there wasn't yet permission for it. And she was dying. She knew she was dying. She was at home here in a bungalow in the park. And Jonathan Caddy, the son of Peter and Eileen, who is a key part of the community here, and also the Hinterland Project and the Green Burial Ground, and he had applied to for permission for this, and they were trying to get it through. He was in touch with someone in the council who said they'd let him know by the end of the day. And at the end of the day, there was nothing. And so he came in to tell my mom that unfortunately we hadn't got that yet. And then he went home, and there was either an email or phone call or something saying that it was granted. So he came down to say, it is. And my mum, who couldn't speak at that point, just gave this huge grin and gave this like thumbs up sign.
Oh.
And that was the Friday, and she died on Sunday.
Oh my gosh, it's as if she was waiting to know.
Yeah.
Oh. Burial grounds do seem to be a real mark of communities growing up and becoming very permanent. You know, the entire life cycle can be played out within community.
Yes. Yeah.
That seems important.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
New babies.
Yeah, new babies too.
Going out.
So we normally ask guests on this podcast for insights, you know, things that they would say they've learned during their period of living in community. Obviously, your experience is vast and has gone over a long period of time. But I'm wondering if you have any kind of key things or messages or things that you would tell people if they were looking to join or live harmoniously within any given community, or essentially any sort of key takeaways that you've learned personally.
A couple of things, but that it may apply to here, but maybe everywhere. I was thinking back to those hands on my shoulder, that very first beginning where you know, it felt so welcoming and friendly. I felt welcomed into a world that was wider than I had anticipated or known up until then. But that sense of welcome, I think learning to feel welcome in the world is important. That we are welcome in the world. Women don't always experience that, but to come back to that experience, because I think coming out of that, then we start to act in ways that support the world in a way. The world that welcomes us, we start to welcome it and hold it in our hearts in a different way, I think, somehow. You know, and here, there's also, Eileen Caddy used to say, all is very, very well. It was something strange. And I think coming back to that as well, that links into me with the feeling welcome. Yeah, I think that underneath things, all is well. Julian of Norwich, I think, said, all is well, and all manner of things will be well. At a time in the world where there were huge disruptions going on, and it have been a difficult thing to say. But I think the practice of touching into that, we fall out of it. Of course, we're not in that the whole time, but it's kind of like a wellspring, I think, that we can connect into and hold and maybe contribute something to the atmosphere of the planetary field.
Thank you. That's actually quite comforting to think that the sort of the inner rhythm is ongoing and eternal, as opposed to our sort of worldly skirmishes that we tend to be quite easily distracted by.
Yeah. And we're not going to get away from those, but can we hold them somehow?
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. It's been really interesting. Thank you for being our guest.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. It's been delightful to talk with you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the go-to place for intentional communities in Britain. As ever, it really helps us if you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, you can find out more about communal living at our website, diggersandreamers.org.uk. There you'll find an online directory of existing communities and developing groups within the UK, plus interactive notice boards and information about our publications. One you won't want to miss is the Diggers and Dreamers directory, which has been referred to as the Communard's Bible for 35 years. And now, to play us out, here are the Spaceheads with their tribute to our old mate, Gerard Winstanley. See you next time.